Thank you, Reese. Thanks for having us. So what we wanted to do, first of all, is just sort of provide a little bit of information about us and also remember the transitions of the slides as well. So my name is Matthew Lee. I'm a nurse, an adult nurse by background, and currently working in the international, well, CPD and international nursing team within this School of Nursing and Health Sciences. A little bit more about my sort of background is, in terms of my ethnicity and mixed race background, definitely white British, but the rest of it gets a little bit unknown. So the reason why I say that is because that side of the family is sort of care experienced, and actually records are not really well kept if you care experienced. And so what I do know is it's not white British. It's either which I know there's a vast polarization of the two, but it's either one side of the family being from either a Black African background or from a Southeast Asian background. And I know there is continents between, but it's just saying the positionality is one side white British, one side not. And also that unknown factor links in with some of my interests in decolonizing, decolonial perspectives, and perspectives that aren't necessarily that Eurocentric standpoint, which we often have as a default, which has led into sort of my doctoral study, which is looking at particularly aspects around mixed race identity, but using sort of Indigenous and decolonial research methodologies and methods to sort of navigate that space and find out that new information. So this was a great opportunity to come and talk about some of that, but also some of what Mark and I have been doing within the programme.
Hi everybody, my name is Mark Whitfield. I am a diagnostic radiographer by background. I work with Matthew in the International Nursing and CPD team. A little bit sort of about my background. Obviously I'm, well not obviously, but I'm white British, but I did sort of grow up in an Irish Catholic background, and I think that's important to recognise, because I think that does inform my kind of approach to decolonialism and sort of sparks my interest in it kind of as well. So I suppose the other thing to mention is that sort of from a working class background, and I was like many of us here, I suppose, one of the first in my family to go to higher education, to university. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're looking at decolonialism, but specifically from a research methods perspective. So Matthew and I teach on the module on our BSc Nursing top-up programme. And that module, well, sorry, a bit about the programme first, I suppose. So the programme is a top-up degree. The students are already normally qualified nurses, and they are looking to kind of upgrade their qualification from a diploma to a honours degree. Within the cohort, it's predominantly internationally educated nurses, so they're from a variety of different backgrounds. I've just given some examples on the board. They're predominantly from Nigeria, but we also have students from Kenya, the Philippines, India, China, and also what normally terms kind of home educated students as well. In terms of their research background, I think most of them describe themselves as having minimal amount of previous research experience. So the research methods module is obviously there, as well as in terms of upskilling those students in that particular area. The module itself is a research proposal, so they've not actually undertaken research, but what they are doing is kind of working it up to the point at which they would apply for ethical approval. So they've got to do all of that kind of ancillary stuff around participant information sheets, consent forms, anything that they're using to collect data with, so data instruments, semi-structured questionnaires and that type of thing. Semi-structured interview schedules, I should say.
So some of the slides that we've included today are actually some of the slides that we've included in this particular module. And the reason why we wanted to bring these to your attention is there might be something that you use within your own work, or it might be something that you think about. But this is a really interesting concept that I've talked about a few different times, so apologies if you see me at different conferences. I like it, so I keep talking about it. But two-eyed seeing is this concept that actually you don't need to look at the weaknesses of one or the other. You're actually saying that there are strengths in sort of Western global North perspectives, but also in Indigenous global South perspectives. And actually it's about synthesizing the two together to get the best of both worlds and actually making the researcher more aligned to different perspectives rather than just based on their own experience, whether that's educationally, societally, or just as part of the community as a whole. And we do recognise that using even the term Indigenous, which is, if we look at different communities, actually has a lot of specificity. If we look at North America, that would be recognising Métis, and it would be recognising First Nations people. In Oceania, that would be recognising sort of Maori, and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, as well as other Indigenous populations around. So when we use that word Indigenous, we are using it broadly, but we recognise the difference and unique nature. But like I said, two-eyed seeing, the best of both bringing together to make a new or better understanding of what we gather in research and what we gather in the world.
So I'm going to take a quantitative methods perspective because that's what I teach within the module, and Matthew's going to talk a bit more about the qualitative research methods and how we've changed them in terms of the decolonial approach. I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that decolonising the curriculum, I think, first came onto my radar about sort of 8 or 9 years ago. This is while I was at Teesside and I was involved in the diagnostic radiography program there. And I thought, absolutely brilliant. You know, there are definite things here that we can take and that we can apply immediately to the way in which we deliver radiography in general and the way in which we deliver radiography education. As an example of that, very simplistically, we could look at all of the radiographic imaging textbooks, and all of the images of patients in all of the major textbooks were white. And in the departments, there's a book called Clark's Radiographic Positioning, and rather bizarrely in there, as well as all of those patients being white, for some bizarre reason, all of the women were topless, regardless of the examination that was being undertaken. So you can make of that kind of what you will. But moving on from that, I kind of thought to myself, well, there's going to be, I was a little bit naive, I suppose, and I thought, well, you know, some of these decolonisation approaches are going to be very easily, in inverted commas, implementable, or that you can see very definite sort of utility. Other things like research methods, and particularly quantitative research methods, probably not going to change that much. And I can tell you that over the last year or so, I find out that that is very much not the case, and there are things that we can do. So moving from that to kind of Matthew's point there about two-eyed seeing, the two quotes that I've got on the PowerPoint slide here, one of them comes from David Spiegelhalter from a blog that he wrote for the Royal Society for Statistical Society. Now, obviously, we've got to recognise that that institution itself sort of derived its knowledge from certain questionable practices, but there is a very definite element for me that links to decolonisation in what he's saying there. And equally, the Svina Collins article, which is from very much a decolonial standpoint, kind of links these two things together. I think that imbibing students with data literacy, the ability to look at data, to look at numbers and be able to unpick them and ask critical questions of them, is something that those students can use to kind of challenge pervasive social norms, to kind of you know, get rid of oppression and those sorts of things. The other element to that, I think, as well, is that within healthcare, in particular, there is a very much a kind of undercurrent of science and positivity that goes through it, positivism, sorry, that goes through it. And I think that often, particularly with TNE students, in my experience, is that they kind of hold quantitative research in a higher regard than perhaps qualitative or even other types of research. So, you know, often students would come to me and they'd have a really good research question and they'd say, but I want to do it quantitatively. And I'd say, well, why? Why do you want to do it quantitatively? And they'd say, because it's proper research. And it's kind of rolling that back and trying to unpick those processes, I think.
And just one thing to mention is the nature of some of the discussion about quantitative elements is that some of the terminology that's used around historically around images, around sort of the experimentation that was done in the name of research, let's say what it was, uses outdated and racist terms. And actually we have a slide which is drawn directly from that, which uses terms which obviously we don't condone that language, but as the nature of what we're talking about is learning lessons from the past to inform the future, and recognizing that this has happened to almost help ourselves and help our students sort of learn from that as well.
And it links back as well to that notion of data literacy and understanding what we can and can't do with numbers. I mean, you know, David Spiegelhalter was quite critical of kind of the general population's ability to deal with numbers, but I don't think it's just the general population. I think when we think about you know, recent reports of Boris Johnson in his tenure as PM, you know, this is a man who can read Homer's Iliad from the ancient Greek, which isn't a prerequisite for leading a country, but is somehow unable to unpick relatively basic statistical analyses, which absolutely should be a prerequisite for running a country. So again, it's trying to kind of, you know, go through and unpick those sorts of things for our students. What I would say is that within the session that I deliver, I try and get the students away from this idea as well that numbers themselves are objective, that numbers themselves in some way speak for themselves. I think that any act of speaking, artificial intelligence probably aside, is in and of itself an act of interpretation. So I think there can be no discussion of numbers without interpretation of them. But we don't kind of come at it from a perspective that all quantitative research is bad or is problematic. What we try to get the students to understand is that it's not necessarily the tool that's the problem, it's the way in which the tool is being operationalized that is potentially the issue. So that's the rationale, I suppose. And what we do from there in terms of our quantitative and qualitative approaches is we do move the spotlight away from the traditional white, Eurocentric, dead white man approach to discussing and talking about the development of statistics. I think for us as well, in terms of delivering it to nurses, we've got to be mindful of doing that. So there's been, I think Matthew could probably corroborate this, but particularly in nursing, there's a move away from kind of just discussing Florence Nightingale, but also discussing other people as well. I keep Florence Nightingale in this because of the intersectional nature of it, but we kind of, you know, put context around that and think about Florence Nightingale, but we also talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, and I do a little foray into Bayesian statistics and talk a little bit about David Blackwell, but I am not an expert in any of that. It's just basically to give the students some kind of awareness, I suppose. But we do touch upon the old guard as well. We talk about, for example, Charles Spearman. We talk about some of the problematic assumptions that fitted in with his work around not just sort of psychology, but also his sort of support for eugenics as a movement, because we think that that's important as well to recognise that. Again, it's not necessarily that factor analysis is inherently bad, it's how factor analysis is used. Finally, in terms of moving the spotlight, we also talk about, or we've updated, I should say, the reading list. We've got some examples of the reading list with us today. We also try to move the authorship and the geography away from the global north and obviously picking up things from the global south and elsewhere as well. So that's the sort of the first element to it. Matthew mentioned about some of the slides that have problematic language on them. So this is an example of the slide that we use in this session. And what I really want the students to get out of it when we discuss this slide is about the notion of counting and who decides what counts and who decides what gets counted, if you like. You know, we look at the work of Du Bois and we look at the work of kind of the scientific racists that sort of stretches from, you know, the mid-1800s through in Australia and Indigenous cultures into the early 1900s around measurements, but also the assumptions that are hidden behind why those are undertaking those particular measurements. You know, we know from genetic analyses that, you know, there is more variation in genetics between, there's more variation within so-called racial groups than there is between the individual racial groups. But obviously, you know, the racial scientific approach kind of was built on the assumption of trying to find those differences and counting things that would enhance their particular viewpoints and their particular worldview. But I think it's important to talk about that because I think, particularly within COVID-19, there was an element of that creeping through, and that has kind of a political variance within it. If we think about some of the studies that purported to show that people from racially minoritized backgrounds are more likely to die of COVID, and then people were supposing that there was some genetic link within that. And there's a political valence that comes into that, isn't there, where, you know, then it's deterministic, there's nothing we can do about it, whilst completely, you know, disregarding all the other factors that play into that, like housing, access to healthcare, access to education, etc. And that takes us through to that kind of social constructiveness of statistics as well. So who decides what to measure and who decides how that is measured? And within this particular activity, we get the students to think about as just a simple thing, the measurement of length. How many different ways are there to measure distance? Whether they use imperial units, which of connotations in and of itself, whether they use metric units, whether they use time, etc. But all of those things are socially constructed. SR units have committees that sit on them that decide how to measure a certain thing. So there is a social constructiveness that comes along with that. And those discussions, I think, are quite transformative for the students. And when we discuss race and the social constructiveness of race, what I also get the students to do is to think about the demographic collection of data within their particular context and recognize that they are the person who perhaps is deciding on what counts in that particular circumstance. So we don't get them to slavishly adhere to the ONS categories, for example. They perhaps need to think about what other categories would be important and that would show things within the data for them. And I think that's important as well for the students who are internationally educated, particularly if they're looking at a home or a different context to a UK northern perspective. The last thing I end with this is just a little thing for the students to think about, which is about, we've all heard of, you know, correlation does not equal causation, but we can also think about no causation without manipulation. If you can't manipulate a particular variable, you cannot infer causation from that. And that's important, particularly when we think about race, because race isn't manipulable. Well, it is, and it has been manipulated in some circumstances, but it can be manipulated on a wider scale. So therefore, what we see in the data, some scholars surmise that that is racism that we see in the data. It's not the effect of race, it's the effect of all of those other things that are having an impact on particular individuals. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that Matthew and I did around ethics. So we've come up with a kind of an ethical map of research. The idea for this is, again, it's part of that history and that learning from history, but also it's to make the students aware that unethical practices obviously are still quite pervasive and still disproportionately affect those within the global south. So a lot of the studies that you can see indicated here in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, those are quite recent, and they're pharmaceutical companies not operationalizing, you know, good ethical practice, getting fully informed consent from participants, you know, not giving them access to adequate healthcare because they're using placebo when they should actually be using the best available medicine or the best available treatment for those particular individuals. So it goes, you know, we haven't just sort of stuck to a northern Eurocentric approach for the discussions there as well.
So what we've done is, we've got a couple of different versions, but they're the same map. It's unethical practices, unethical research that's been highlighted. And the whole point is that we can build on this as maybe students share, knowledge, or staff share knowledge of different studies that have been unethical, and we can add those to this list, each with sort of content warnings, as you can see, about historical terms or racist terms being used, or even the nature of the studies. Some of the studies are quite hard.
Horrific.
Horrific. That's much better, because to be honest, reading through some of these, especially more recently reading through the Guatemala syphilis experimentation, let's call it what it is, the language that's used and the way that they set about to do this is, as Mark says, quite horrific. And it's often looking at marginalized communities within communities. So in Guatemala, we looked at a smaller population, which was the indigenous population, whilst also you can see probably from the years that there's a colonial legacy. There was actually experimentation happening upon people rather than with them. And what we're trying to do is sort of refocus that, so students consider that working with participants to construct research which is actually ethical, obviously, but is actually going to benefit that community and that society as well, which is really imperative. So we've got some of the texts today that we can hand out, and we're going to do that later, but some of these texts actually exist in the library. So if you're thinking about reading lists and thinking about how you can diversify, and obviously one of the considerations is it's not just about the reading list, it's about the content, it's about the whole holistic approach to your teaching, to your content. But this is one area. Now, you might think that I've made a mistake going from 1 to 3, but it's intentional. The reason why I've excluded 2 and 4 is that you can absolutely access this book, okay, which is by Chalissa. And in it, Chalissa talks about a marginalized community, and they talk about the community, it being taboo to write down the name of the people and referencing them, speaking their name as well. And so what I was sort of thinking was, well, if there's a taboo about speaking about the name, writing down the name, absolutely fine for Chalissa to use that, but I'm not going to put that on the slides, so you can choose to access it or not. Some of the considerations for this community were about possession. So the people believed that they would be or could be possessed by spirits, bush spirits particularly. And then it talks about the ethics of, is it ethical to conduct research on someone who believes themselves to be possessed? And that gets into a bit of an ethical discussion, because either the researcher believes them to be possessed and is conducting the research on them and is asking them to sign either when they are possessed or when they are not possessed, and actually does that consent traverse from possession to non-possession, or they believe them to maybe have a mental health condition and they would be maybe a more vulnerable group. But ultimately, how many times do people conduct research and actually take into account the fact that their cultural belief may be that they are possessed? Whether they are possessed, whether they have a mental health condition is a separate discussion, but actually the research being conducted on these people or other people needs to be factored in. And that's where it comes from. Is it ethical to write about the research on the basis of what others say about them? Which is the other thing, is observing people from afar. There are still some communities, indigenous, that are observed from afar, and people write about those communities, but they have not consulted with those communities to say, can we do this? They use far observational study. And that's something that sort of, even that discussion of possession, indigenous communities otherwise, is something that we build into some of our content as well. As well as this, now you might think, why is there a crocodile? And this is from a conversation that Mark and I had about indigenous perspectives, artwork, particularly from Oceania, looking top down, often images, crocodiles looking down. If I brought something like a stuffed crocodile up now, and I asked you to draw it, you would probably draw it from different angles. You might draw it from the front, from the side, from the top, but that is all about the perception and all about maybe how you have constructed your artistry, how you do that. It might have some cultural connections, But it is important to note that we look at things differently based upon our own experiences, life experiences, what has shaped us. We talk about this study, which was conducted in Sierra Leone, and it was basically saying that they could track Ebola, and they could track Ebola by mobile phone. And they thought, this is fantastic. Everyone has a mobile phone, they put it in the pocket, they travel everywhere with it, because that is based upon a global north Western narrative. You have your phone, you have it in your pocket. Many of you might have a phone in your pocket now, and it might never leave your side. Now, what they found with that assumption was that wasn't correct for this population. What happened was there was a communal phone that was left in one location, whilst the person or people went out, could be traveling 10, 20, 30 miles to another community and potentially passing Ebola from one person to the next. But from the researchers, they felt that because they were tracking the phone and the GPS, that it wasn't moving beyond those bounds, which is really problematic because actually that inference already is giving you skewed data. And actually, from a health perspective, you could have communities that potentially transmitted a communicable disease from one person to the next, and they do not know about it because your data is telling you that no one has ever left that particular community. So therefore, resources aren't affected, and that research that actually informs practice and healthcare provision. Also considerations such as your methodology. Now, you might look and think, well, actually, it's similar, but deriving from a more Afrocentric methodology, looking at the Ma'at and the Nomo. Ma'at being the quest for justice, truth, and harmony. Nomo being that knowledge creation to improve human life and relations. And you might think, well, that's what we do, that's part of our methodology. But I think actually it's interesting, even just drawing this out into something and saying, why do we always look at a Eurocentric global north perspective as a first instance? Why don't we look at other sides? Now, this isn't saying, obviously, we recognize that Africa as a continent is huge. There's so much difference and diversity between country and country, people within those countries. But actually, Eurocentric, Afrocentric, there is a discussion right there. Is like, which do we default to and why do we do that? The storytelling nature of either Indigenous communities, particularly using that storytelling, that oral tradition, passing information on, not by written scribe, but actually by talking about it. This is one of those methods and approaches that can connect communities, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And something that you'll see, or you may see coming from Oceania, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is something called yarning. And yarning is about telling a story. It's about giving something of the researcher to the participant back and forth, so that you're having more of a open dialogue, and that twists and turns of that conversation can naturally move, and it's up to the researcher to work in partnership with the participant to sort of shape and navigate, a bit like I sort of visualize it a bit as a river, sort of winding through. There might be twists and turns, it's not going to be straight, but you're ultimately trying to keep on track. Now, yarning has different threads: social yarning, research, work, a particular topic, could be collaborative or therapeutic. But the whole nature is that the decolonial aspect is that you are giving something of yourself to that conversation rather than being almost behind that glass prism almost. Some people will say, well, is it a semi-structured interview or is it yarning? Well, actually, that whole construct of a question right there means that we're already trying to pin it on something that we know and understand, rather than saying, is yarning its own entity, which it is different. And actually, we don't have to say it's like something that we understand. We can say yarning is yarning, semi-structured interviews are semi-structured interviews, and other methods exist and are different. And actually, it's working out which method will work in the best way to work with the community that you're working with. More recently, we became aware of sort of digital storytelling evolving from this different areas such as yarning and so on, which has allowed people to use sort of digital methods to capture voices which could be used and passed to generation, because there's a lot of wealth of knowledge that can be shared. And if you think about your own experiences, how much information has been passed, whether it's from family, whether it's from friends, whether it's from studying, that information is often passed in that way. But by digital storytelling, it can be captured in a way and revisited, and it could be watched again, it can be transferred to the next generation. It could be that a voice that's been lost by someone dying is able to be preserved, but not in a way that's meaning that it has to be captured in writing, because actually that almost negates the effect of that oral tradition. Another is, and please forgive my pronunciation of some of these words, the Talanoa interview methods, which is a method originating in Samoa. And this is group discussions. So you've got the Tala, which is about talking, and the Noa without a fixed agenda. The Talanoa itself would be that open one-to-one group discussion, any combination of people, any concept, often less sensitive topics being discussed. Whereas the Farfo would be this closed group discussion, much more carefully selected participants and more serious discussion topics. It's about working with the topic and working out which is appropriate. Now, as I said, this is something that can be used for research, or it can actually be used for community engagement. And I have noticed that Talanoas have been used sort of just to engage with people. Often thinking about positioning, and often we'll think about that as where do we sit compared to our participants? Is it circle? Is it across the desk? Is it at a podium? Is there something between us, or is there sort of a connection that can be drawn? So we've sort of really glanced over some of the topics there and mentioned some of what we talk about and how we talk about it, but it's not an exhaustive list. And one of the things that we're actually organising at the moment is a reapproval. So we're going through the process. We have colleagues with a range of different educational experience, nursing experience around Europe, and we have colleagues that have had experience in the international nursing team in different areas of Europe, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, whether that's culturally heritage, whether it's working. And what we're aiming to do is be in that space and draw from those different experiences to try and create something which is actually representative of both our educators, but also of the students that we have. And there will be things that Mark and I have not mentioned here, and we are not professing to know every single thing. What we're saying is we've tried to branch out from something that is taught in a certain way in a certain time. So that's one of our next steps, is looking at the program itself.
We're almost looking to move away from a research methods focused approach and trying to weave, so we can start from almost from scratch and try to sort of weave in decolonisation throughout the whole module, because I think at the moment it's kind of, I think Matthew described it really well to me today, which we're trying to retrofit it into the curriculum. And I think one of the good things with having this move forward is that we're going to be able to weave it in and weave in research methods so that it doesn't sit as a kind of standalone entity, but perhaps we've got opportunity to weave it in and weave it across all the different modules as well. And of course, Reese's Toolkit will be an imperative part of that.
Absolutely. So I've got some examples of textbooks that we've, some library copies, one I've actually home, which is library copies out.
Yeah, both of the library copies are mine, by the way, so please don't run off with them.
But the reason why we brought these is to say that these exist. These exist in physical copy or in e-copy. And you can access these to add to your reading list, and it's great to see. Now, like I said, it's not just reading lists, but one element of the module is the reading list, where you get the information from, what it says, how it constructs that knowledge. And a lot of the sources that we've used today have been derived from some of these textbooks. There will be other textbooks out there, other sources. And if you know of these, please, let's have a knowledge exchange. Let's share these. There might be things that we don't use that you know about. Please tell us. We would welcome that. We hope this has been a sort of consideration for how you can embed some of these thoughts within your program, whether you do empirical research or you talk about research methods broadly. But we welcome any discussions outside of this platform, and let us know if you have any questions.